Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, welcome to the show today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. We're going to visit today a little bit about what went on a few years ago when we talked a lot about Yanukovych getting thrown out of his presidency as an elected leader, in Ukraine. And we talked back then about Victoria Nuland and also about the Pyatt, the ambassador, and how they were conspiring. But evidently there was a lot more going on than that. But right before we get to that, I want to mention a thing, and this is an important week for NATO. NATO's having a big meeting. But I saw today that Afghanistan is going to go to this NATO meeting. And they have a little minor request because they're a stable country now, and it's unified, and everything is settled. So that government, which is purely a democratic elected government, has nothing to do with our empire. But they're making a request to the United States and to NATO for $5 billion a year for 5 years. So just casually, we're coming there. We're your guy.
Have your checkbook ready.
So take care of it. And also this week, NATO's announcing that they're going live with the missiles in Poland and different places, which is part of the same problem. But this week, just a couple days ago, we had the release of some tapes, some emails. Yeah. And it had to do with a very prominent general in NATO, Philip Breedlove. And evidently he was working behind the scenes. We talked about Nuland and Pyatt, but here this NATO commander at the time was pushing very, very hard, and he was engaged with other people and how they were going to change this Obama, who was much too restrained. Of course, we think he's not restrained enough. And they wanted to change this attitude. They were up against the wall with this terrible president because the president has said, do not get me involved in a war. Specifically, he's talking about Russia. And so there was a conflict. So this general was plotting behind the scenes. Here's a headline, Press TV, General plotted against Obama on Russia. And this is exactly what they were doing in trying to organize, even talking about how are we going to get the media involved and how are we going to do this. So do you think it's par for the course, or is this a little bit worse than par for the course?
It's a case like the movie Wag the Dog. It's incredible because the president obviously, first of all, Breedlove is the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. He's a top NATO general. He's also a 4-star U.S. general in the U.S. Air Force. So he was not happy, as you pointed out, with President Obama's policy toward Russia, which was not as confrontational as he would like. And so he proceeded to use all back channels. I would say it was a full court press, using all back channels possible to put pressure, including putting pressure on U.S. public opinion about what was happening in Russia and Ukraine. And this was directly going behind the back of his commander-in-chief. And it's interesting, though, this happened 4 days ago or so. The Intercept was the first to run with an article about it, and it was picked up by a few other sources. Then it just sort of fell off the face of the earth. Yeah.
And this whole idea of the propaganda machine, they did that in the Persian Gulf War and leading up to the Iraq War. But once again, some pictures shown, with this procedure of overthrowing Yanukovych. They were using old pictures of Russian tanks, saying that the Russians are there, they're ready to invade. So here they were actually literally saying, I think it was Wesley Clark. He went to Wesley Clark for advice and said, Breedlove, you got to get the lobbyists in there, pay them. And, that's exactly what they did. I mean, it was atrocious of how viciously they used the media back in the war, the Persian Gulf War. So, this is what generals do. They use all tools and go ahead and lie and use the media, and the media never checks, or they're a part of the conspiracy. But this is one conspiracy that it's a truthful conspiracy. This one is based on fact. We have the evidence, and obviously Nuland and Pyatt wouldn't have objected to Breedlove. And so it is a NATO operation, and that's why, of course, I object so much to NATO dictating our foreign policy. And this to me is just another example of how how our foreign policy backfires on us and how it doesn't achieve anything. And it turns out that it's more anti-Russia than anything else. And I think Breedlove literally said we ought to ditch this diplomacy stuff. You know, we shouldn't be talking to these people.
Well, I think it's a fascinating look behind the scenes at how policy gets created and how it gets sold. Because as you point out, Wesley Clark, you know, Breedlove went to Clark saying, how can I ramp this thing up? How can I jack this thing up and get the conflict started? And he said, well, you got to tell the Ukrainians, i.e. the people that we put in office, you got to tell them to hire a top flight PR firm in the Beltway and have them start pushing out the information warfare. But what's interesting, you think about information warfare, that was directed against us, against Americans. So he's telling a NATO general, hire a top law firm, or a top PR firm, that's thousands and thousands of dollars a month, tens of thousands a month, to lie to the American people. And you point out too, the fake pictures, the fake testimony, all of these things are made up. This is the people that are supposed to be keeping us safe at war with us. And remember at the time, you know, we challenged some of these things, these Russian tanks. Where are they? Show us the proof. He said 1,000 Russian tanks were in Ukraine. Show us the pictures. We never saw them. But when we question, and especially when your institute questioned it, oh, you're just Putin lovers. You're just you know, you're in the pay of the Kremlin. Well, it turns out we were right.
Yeah, and but the whole thing is they believe in intervention. There's different degrees of it, but once you start doing a little bit, then you have this argument within the interventionists to what to do. The people were on our side back then. Remember, they talked about a vote in the Congress. Well, that's old-fashioned. Finally, the people spoke out at the time, but then it didn't matter. They went ahead and did all the bombing and escalation anyway. You know, when it came to Syria.
Here is the other thing that's interesting, and this is the role of the think tanks. It's critical. The PR firms are important, but the think tanks are so important too, because that's where the experts are. And there was an email of Breedlove to the Atlantic Council, and the Atlantic Council sells itself as an objective think tank with great experts. Well, in fact, it's paid by NATO, i.e. it's paid by the American taxpayer to propagandize in favor of war. And here's what Breedlove wrote to the Atlantic Council when he was trying to push this. He said, well, I think the president sees us as a threat to be minimized. Us meaning all these people that are supposedly working for the American people, but are actually pushing war.
Well, this is an important point, because you're saying we are the victim of the illegal bias propaganda that our own government, that the people pay for to make sure that we listen to all these lies, which is pretty successful, something I've argued about all the time, about we have to beat the propagandists of what's going on. But then when you think of it in making us safe, you know, there's a lot of terror out there and a lot of people getting killed. Just remember, there's almost 100 people killed in the last 15 years by terrorists in this country. And yet that's the dominant theme. Even under polling, people are most concerned about being attacked by a terrorist. And I could point out a few other things. But so there's a fear out there, and there's some bad people out there. And guess what? Our liberties get undermined. We were attacked there. Not only are we attacked by the false propaganda and the lies that we pay for, when it comes to it, then we're the one who lose our liberties. You know, whether it's our Second Amendment right or Fourth Amendment right, whether we have to just be on lists and we're harassed, and government becomes more privacy, and then all of a sudden you find the Justice Department, the last thing they're in the business of is providing justice for anybody. So this is a real tragedy. I hope the American people wake up to this and start listening to that and say, oh no, what we need to do is, they're bad people, bomb them more. You know, like not too long, I think it was on Orlando, you know, it was, people were concerned, just go bomb them some more, you know, and without even thinking. And the last thing they'd want to think is that maybe our policies have something to do with this, and this to me is the real tragedy that they don't think in those terms.
It's interesting you mentioned terrorism and the fear of terrorism. This just underscores the duplicity of someone like General Breedlove. He recognized, he said, well, you know, in this age, this is one of his emails, in this age where everyone seems to be worried about ISIS, we got to figure out a way to get our issue on the front burner. We got to get some attention with this Russia-Ukraine thing. So clearly manipulation of public opinion.
And so our obvious frustration is that they're debating this, and Obama is the so-called peacekeeper, you know, and yet here he is, he was participating in the overthrow of Yanukovych, and he gets involved, and he's given us all this chaos since 2011 in Syria, and yet he represents the least militant of them all.
Yeah.
But I think this also, you know, makes the point that people undermine, stab each other in the back, and they'll do it to the president too, if he's slightly, you know, off what they believe in. So neoconservatives are a powerful bunch of people, and they'll resort to anything that they can think of.
And the propaganda works. You remember this too in the time of the Iraq War. If you were opposed to the Iraq War, it meant that you were in love with Saddam Hussein. You thought he was great. The same thing with Gaddafi. Oh, you love Gaddafi. Now, we remember how you were pilloried in the media, that you were just Putin's lapdog and all this. And it's effective, though.
Yeah, you know, but I still believe truth wins out in the end. Remember how Jimmy Duncan said that was his toughest vote, to stay out of the Iraq War, and he was in a military district, and they gave him a lot of grief, but now it's his best vote ever. But it's rough to get by that. Sometimes you lose your office, you know, because of that. But fortunately, every once in a while we do hear that other people lose their office when they're on the other side of our issue, you know, that they're too much involved in war, and I work on the assumption that most people really want peace, and they need a lot of propaganda, a lot of lies, and a lot of intimidation, fear-mongering to get people so riled up that they're willing to, you know, go and do dumb things that will lead to war. And that, of course, has been our foreign policy for a long time.
Well, let's just hope that Breedlove doesn't graduate from NATO into some top high-paying job somewhere. Let's hope he has a little bit of shame heaped onto him, shame that he deserves.
Yeah, well, he probably was ready for retirement, but it would make me feel a little bit better that the president said, "Enough is enough. Hey, you're defying the boss." And I said, "Don't do that." And yet he went and did that anyway. But I don't know whether he probably was ready for retirement. But what I want to retire is the ideology of the neoconservatives who believe that we have a mission, and it's a humanitarian mission of spreading American exceptionalism and doing all these good things for the world. At the same time, what they're involved in is militarism for all kind of nefarious reasons, to sell weapons and whatever. Because, you know, even with Obama, you know, complaining about what was going on there, he is sending hundreds of millions of dollars of non-lethal weapons to the government that we installed. And, you know, and sometimes the left who are anti-war will buy into that. Oh, well, you know, we won't send them weapons and we'll vote against the war, but we'll just send the money to our favorite thug, and they'll pass it out and feed the poor. And, you know, for some reason, it just doesn't work out very well.
That's true.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Obviously, what's going on this week, dealing with NATO, there will be a lot more news on this, and we'll be talking about it some more. But as far as I'm concerned, we don't need NATO. NATO is not a friend of peace. NATO is something that if we'd have listened to Robert Taft, we'd have never joined NATO. He would really, really be upset. Even if those who were converted into supporting NATO back then when they had a Soviet empire, that's a different story. They don't exist. And all of a sudden to try to concoct this same thing that one of the arguments of Breedlove is they are an existential threat. It's the Russians. They're at fault. And nobody says, well, why are we putting, you know, maybe the weapons we're putting on their borders and antagonizing people and changing leadership around their country. Maybe they have a little bit of justification and they just haven't dreamed up the problems that they face. But nevertheless, this is going to go on for a while. I know that Russia is not a perfect nation. There are no perfect nations out there. But the only moral responsibility that we have right now where we can deal with it is our own government. And the government is supposed to be taking care of us, and we should point it out. I do work on the assumption that a patriotic person is one willing to criticize one's own government when they're doing the wrong thing. And I think we're doing the wrong thing when it comes to our monetary policy with the Federal Reserve, and we're doing the wrong thing when it comes to our interventionist foreign policy overseas. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.